Hello and welcome to another TGS English poetry tutorial. The focus of this tutorial is to look at the poem Kamikaze. This is the final poem in your AQA poetry anthology, and the aim of this session, just like the other tutorials, is to use the steps to success to study the poem Kamikaze. So make sure you've got highlighters, pens for annotating. Obviously, you need a copy of the poem that can be found online if you don't have a hard copy. And what you're going to end up with is a set of really lovely detailed revision notes and hopefully a secure understanding of the poem Kamikaze. So if you remind yourself, the first thing you need to do is to think about the title. So the title of the poem, Kamikaze, it might remind you of Ozymandias. You might be sat here watching this thinking, well, I have no idea. You might have never heard of the word kamikaze, but pause the video, force yourself to try and think of some connotations, consider what does this word sound like. Okay, so now you've done that, similar to Ozymandias, you might think, well, this sounds like quite a foreign word, so perhaps the poem is exploring a different culture. Again, like Ozymandias, this word sounds quite powerful. Kamikaze, almost slightly mystical. Perhaps, again, it's the name of someone or the name of something, perhaps a title. We're going to find out a little bit more about kamikaze pilots. Now, you might have heard of kamikaze pilots, but for your AA3, this is your need to know. Kamikazes were suicide attackers, and they were launched by the Japanese against the Allied forces in World War II. So if you've ever seen the film Pearl Harbor, you might understand what I'm referring to. So essentially, kamikaze pilots flew small planes of explosives over the enemy and then detonated them. Often they would actually fly into ships and detonate the whole ship, and obviously they would inevitably die in the attack as well. We're going to find out a little bit more about kamikaze pilots, and beyond this, there's a lot more online, so you can go away and do some additional research. But what I would like you to do is to read the article and make sure you've got a pen and a piece of paper and go through and just summarise the information and note down key things that might help you and you might be bringing into an essay for your context AA3. The key questions that you should consider as you read, and please pause the video and make a note of these. What was a kamikaze pilot? What was their aim? And why would these young men sacrifice themselves? Okay, so here is the information. So read it through, and like I said, just condense your notes and make sure you're able to answer these 3 questions. You've done that. Hopefully that's just given you a bit more of an understanding about who kamikaze pilots were. And I think most importantly, it's vital to understand that this has been a part of Japanese culture and tradition for centuries. And I certainly think for us as a reader in the 21st century, it's difficult to understand the motivations of these kamikaze pilots. But actually, as we read more into the history and the culture and the tradition, we can start to understand why these men did what they did. Now, if you think back to steps to success, we're going to read the poem once, and then what you can do is pause the video, go back, listen to it again, or read it yourself. But it's really important you do read the poem through twice. So make sure you've got the poem in front of you. Just going to show you some visuals as I read it to you, which hopefully will help you to understand each stanza as we go through. Her father embarked at sunrise with a flask of water, a samurai sword in the cockpit, a shaven head full of powerful incantations, and enough fuel for a one-way journey into history. But halfway there, she thought, recounting it later to her children, he must have looked far down at the little fishing boats strung out like bunting on a green-blue translucent sea. And beneath them, arcing in swathes like a huge flag waved first one way and then the other in a figure of 8, the dark shoals of fishes flashing silver as their bellies swiveled towards the sun. And remembered how he and his brothers, waiting on the shore, built cairns of pearl-grey pebbles to see who's withstood longest the turbulent inrush of breakers, bringing their father's boat safe, yes, grandfather's boat safe to the shore, salt-sodden, awash with cloud-marked mackerel, black crabs, feathery prawns, the loose silver of whitebait, and once a tuna, the dark prince, muscular, dangerous. And though he came back, my mother never spoke again in his presence, nor did she meet his eyes, and the neighbours too. They treated him as though he no longer existed. Only we children still chattered and laughed, till gradually we too learned to be silent, to live as though he had never returned, that this was no longer the father we loved. And sometimes, she said, he must have wondered which had been the better way to die. Hope you enjoyed that. This is certainly one of my favourite poems in the anthology. And I'm going to talk you through 3 things to analyse. But beyond that, do add to your annotations. I just think the language in this poem is absolutely stunning. And there's definitely more to analyse beyond the 3 foci. But for now, pause the video and use these prompt questions just to make some initial notes. Just check you understand who is speaking in this poem. It's not the Kamikaze pilot. So just check you understand who that voice belongs to. Think about what actually happens in this poem. Think about the beginning, how it progresses. How do you feel when you read it? Certainly, I feel really strong emotions at the end of the poem. How do you feel when you get to the end? I've now made some notes. I'm just going to go through these 5 questions just so you can check your notes against mine and just to make sure that you do understand the basics. So who is speaking in this poem? Well, the main voice is the voice of the pilot's granddaughter. So in the first line, when she writes, her father embarked at sunrise, she's talking about her mother's father. Okay, so the granddaughter is speaking, but then we also have the voice of the mother. For example, if you look at the end, and sometimes she said, he must have wondered. So that is her mother speaking. So the granddaughter is recounting things that her mother said in reference to her father and the poetic speaker's grandfather. So what does the Kamikaze pilot decide to do? So if you look at stanza 1, he is embarking on his mission and he is ready to die. He's willing to sacrifice his life. He is a kamikaze pilot and that's what he needs to do. But you can see in the second stanza, halfway there, he changes his mind and he looks down and he remembers things from his childhood. He's looking at the beauty of nature and he decides to not go through with it. Now, in terms of what influences his decision, this whole section, you've got stanza 2, 3, 4, and 5. We get an insight into what swayed his decision. We've got lots of descriptions of nature, and we've also got a real emphasis on the power of memory. Of things that he looked at and things that he remembered made him change his mind. Now, in terms of how others react, we learn that when the pilot returns to, say, his village and his family, we learn that neighbours treated him as if he no longer existed. So he's essentially shunned from his community. He becomes ostracised. He's an outcast. And it's as if he's not really even alive anymore. How does the poem make you feel? Well, I think this is really personal and it depends on the reader, but certainly for me, I just find the last 2 lines so incredibly tragic as he wonders which was actually a better way to die. Because of the way he's treated when he returns home, it's as if life actually wasn't worth living. We'll look into that more later on. So what we're going to do now is start to make some annotations. So if you remember, we've got our 3 foci, and we're going to start with focus 1, which is from the beginning of the poem. So what you need to do is write down this quotation, or you might be making notes around the poem. And if you remember, we're looking at language, structure, themes, ideas, poet intentions, and context. Really, really important that you focus on quality. So use the prompt questions as you have been doing to develop your analysis and try to write as much as you can just about this one section from stanza 2. Now you finish your annotating, you can compare your notes to mine. Now, hopefully for language, you picked up on the really beautiful, vivid imagery in this section of the poem. And it does continue, like I said, do go beyond stanza 2. There's lots more to look at. But what the poet is doing is creating this very vivid and striking image of nature. Nature is presented as being incredibly beautiful. And I really love the simile, the fishing boats strung out like bunting. It's almost childlike as the pilot recalls her happy memories from childhood. And I think the bunting for me really is a kind of image and a symbol of celebration, almost as if nature itself is being celebrated, because bunting is kind of strung up to signify an occasion or some form of celebration. And then the really specific details given to the description of the sea through adjectives such as green, blue, and translucent pay homage to the beauty of nature. And it's really important to remember it's this beauty that will trigger the pilot's change of mind. So moving on to structure and form. What I picked up on in this stanza, and it does continue in other stanzas as well, is the use of enjambment to create a sense of the pilot's awe at the nature below him. So this idea of each line continuing onto the next creates a sense of the beauty of nature being continuous and never ending. It also helps to create this very kind of lyrical rhythm, suggesting the scenes that he's seeing below him were incredibly beautiful to the eyes. And the last line of the stanza, notice it continues on to the next, perhaps suggesting that the beauty of nature is overwhelming and continuous, and ultimately, again, to reinforce the point that these sites were crucial in resolving the pilot's inner conflict. And that inner conflict is between whether he should fulfill his duty or whether he actually chooses to live and to go against that sense of duty. So I've mentioned inner conflict. Let's explore themes and ideas, power and conflict in more detail. So notice that the granddaughter has to speculate. He must have. She's almost just trying to attempt to understand what caused him to turn back. And this ultimately suggests that what happened to the pilot and this inner conflict he was experiencing actually hasn't been spoken about. He's not had the opportunity. And this in turn highlights the power of culture, tradition, and honour. He has been literally silenced by his family and by his community. And it's particularly interesting in exposing the power of culture, tradition, and honour. The family just have to kind of second guess at what had happened. It's also worth noting the reference to bunting almost becomes ironic. Now, people would actually celebrate the death of kamikaze pilots. They would see their death as incredibly honourable. And there's a real heavy sense of irony here as well, because the bunting's being used in reference to nature, but actually for the family, it is about celebrating the honour of the kamikaze pilots and what they do. And again, this is alluding to the power of duty and tradition. The pilot, I've mentioned this already, but the pilot is experiencing inner conflict, and that inner conflict is between his sense of duty versus his desire and will to live. I mean, this might be slightly too far-fetched, but I think the word translucent is particularly interesting. Although the sea is described as translucent, I think it becomes almost symbolic that the pilot can almost start to see clearly. He's beginning to view life as precious, and actually that realization is overriding the powerful incantations that are mentioned at the start of the poem. And in seeing clearly, he's able to make this very difficult decision. So last but not least, we're now going to look at poet intentions and context. Now, it's worth noting that fishing is a practice deeply ingrained in Japanese culture. And it's not a surprise, therefore, that the poet does focus this whole stanza and actually several other stanzas describing fish and the sea. And the pilot is therefore engaging with the essence of his country and his own being. And it's this, again, that makes him decide he wants to live. Now, whilst the poem is about the Japanese tradition of kamikaze pilots, it's also worth knowing that it's about, I think, more than anything, about the Japanese values of Shinto. And essentially what that means is the appreciation of nature. So with that in mind, perhaps the poet is suggesting that nature, and I think also memory comes into it as well, that nature can be incredibly powerful. And nature has the ability to override religion, culture, and tradition. Now we're going to work independently to look at focus 2. Now, can I strongly suggest you really think about the power of culture and tradition in this section? And I'm just going to give you pointers to help you with your analysis. And please continue to make annotations around these 4 boxes. But this is what I want you to use. Okay, so think about the tone. How does the tone of this stanza change from the previous? What is being described? Look at the repetitive use of the pronouns his, him, and he. Why might these nameless pronouns have been used? Look at the verb learned, till gradually we too learned to be silent. And again, how can you link that to the power of culture and tradition? And then lastly, what poetic device has been used at the end of most lines? What effect does this have? So if you pause the video here, use these prompt questions, and also following the language, structure, themes, ideas, poet intentions, and context to guide you in your analysis. We're going to focus on the last 2 lines of the poem. So if you pause the video here, and I'll leave this up so you can make your own annotations, again, trying to get as much detail as you can. Okay, let's compare notes. So language, hopefully you notice there is a massive shift in the type of language used in this part of the poem. And the language now becomes very simplistic and very direct. And that provides a stark contrast to the very vivid descriptions that we were analysing for the first part of the poem. Now, this directness of the language enables us to understand that although tragic in terms of what's happened to the pilot, this actually was just an accepted way of thinking and behaving within this community and as a part of Japanese culture. And I think for us as a reader, certainly for me, it comes across as so blunt and it makes the line so tragic, but actually this is a part of their culture and tradition. Now, again, we've got the use of that modal verb must. So we've got this repeated use, and it once again reiterates that the family are only able to speculate about what the pilot thought. So the mother says that he must have wandered, but they don't know because they don't talk to him, and that distance again adds to the tragedy of this final line. So the pilot has become an outcast, and they clearly do not have a close relationship with him. And again, we see that repeated pronoun he. So this distance is reinforced through the use of that pronoun. Okay, so structure and form. Let's zoom in on that. Notice now we've got the caesura disrupting the natural rhythm established in the previous stanzas. So it kind of reinforces, I think, the importance of these final lines. The caesura really slows the pace in this final part of the poem and helps to establish a very remorseful tone. And the daughter perhaps does feel regret over her and her family's treatment of the father. You almost get a slightly melancholic, regretful, remorseful tone in the final part. And perhaps the only reason he wandered is because of the way he's been ostracised on returning home. So he's questioning his decision, and consequently it creates another internal conflict. Now he's got to live with this conflict. Actually, should I have killed myself and gone through with it in the first place? So in terms of themes and ideas, the poet is presenting the complexity of the pilot's situation. And like I just mentioned, we almost have a new inner conflict of the pilot. And it is once again reiterated that culture and tradition can be incredibly powerful. The pilot, in many ways, has already died. He's lost all respect, he's lost his social standing, and he's not recognised as a member of his own community. He's not even seen as a member of his own family. And although his previous internal conflict has been resolved, it has tragically created, like I've mentioned, a new conflict between himself, but also himself and his family and local community as well. In terms of poet intentions, again, we don't know, but certainly we can speculate what Garland is trying to do. And I think this final line enables her to allude to the issue surrounding how much power culture, tradition, and duty can carry. And despite the pilot choosing to go against his sense of duty, he's ultimately punished by his friends and family. And if you remove yourself from the situation and really think about that, he's being punished because he's chosen to live. And that raises all sorts of kind of moral questions as well. And the end of the poem subtly suggests that the speaker might actually regret her attitude towards him. And there's definitely a sense in the granddaughter's voice of not really wanting to conform to and to follow the family's culture and tradition. Certainly there are quite a lot of hints, especially in the second to last stanza, the line, "Only we children still chattered and laughed, till gradually we too learned to be silent." So actually this is something the granddaughter has almost been forced to learn. And again, that enables Garland to expose the dangers of prioritising the power of culture and tradition over family, and also things like choosing to live and to live your life as you choose. So you are now coming to the end of your study of Kamikaze. I hope you've enjoyed this poem. A really good thing to do now, or to come back to and complete, is to cover up your notes and to consolidate your understanding. So without looking at your notes, try to do the following. Write down 3 things you've learned about Japanese culture and tradition, 2 things that you've learned about the power and conflicts that is explored in the poem, 2 points about language in the poem, 2 points about structure, and 1 point about the poet's intentions.